Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today, the three of us are going to talk about one of the dark initiations of being alive, which is grief and bereavement. When someone that we're deeply connected to falls away from us, falls into the underworld, and we're left trying to make sense of that, sometimes trying to follow them to where they may be, sometimes trying to reconstruct them in our psychological life or even in the environment. But all of those situations require coming to grips with the great space in which they used to occupy. And how do we do that in a soulful way? And what happens when we're failing to do that?
You know, we just talked about how none of us feels that we really understand this topic, and that is implicit in it. It goes beyond us. It takes us where it takes us with the sense of loss. And everybody's process is highly individual. There is no formula for it. It is a real night sea journey that is more than we can really comprehend, and a huge part of life on earth is somehow making felt meaning of the death of a loved one and relearning the world after that person has departed.
Yeah, and I'm aware sort of clinically how unique each person's experience of the death of a loved one is. I don't know that anyone sort of tells us this, but I think that I know that there's no one right way to mourn a loved one, and that each of us might have a unique experience of that process.
So I'm moved to just create a frame in my own mind for how to begin to approach the topic. So one of the assumptions with grief and bereavement is that there is someone in our life that we have a deep attachment to. And we generally, we watch the news, we read the newspaper, and we hear about someone that's passed away, and it may have little to no emotional effect. So at the beginning, we're examining the nature of the attachment that we have to the person. And that varies widely. We have a child who may disastrously pass away, and that's a certain kind of love. We might have a spouse, a beloved spouse that passes away, and that's another category. And then, in a very complicated way, someone may pass away that we have a very ambivalent relationship with, somebody that we kind of loved and despised, and then perhaps expectedly or unexpectedly, they're taken out of our lives. And I think there's probably a unique process to how we withdraw from our idea of that person in order to return to our lives. So one of the things I think I just want to talk about is how really complicated it is to lose a child. That there's this enormous archetypal feeling that the natural order has been violated, that some kind of supernatural horror has been visited upon a person. And people are left often with very existential questions that I think really interrupt the letting go process.
Yeah, Joseph, you said that you imagine that there's kind of a unique process that someone might have to go through. if there's, kind of ambivalent or even just sort of straightforwardly negative feelings to someone that you're attached to. For example, if you've had a very difficult relationship with a parent, when that parent dies, I almost think it's harder to mourn someone that you have deeply ambivalent or negative feelings toward, because for one thing, the community doesn't support you in the same way. I mean, I think when you really just feel mournful and sad, you get held in community, hopefully, in that experience, and you get mirrored. But if part of what you're thinking is, kind of relief, like, God, I'm glad this person's not in my life anymore, which some people feel when a parent dies. How does that get mirrored? What do you do with that? I think it's a little bit more difficult to metabolize.
And it feels very transgressive for people to even admit it to themselves or admit it to their friends. I think we do gently tug on that thread to get them to talk about it in analysis, but they have to overcome and accept a lot about their own humanity.
And I'm also adding another kind of grief, which is aligned with that somewhat, but a little different, ambiguous loss, where someone has, let us say, Alzheimer's and has been loved as a parent, perhaps, but is there, but is really not there. And that too creates tremendous mixed feelings when that person dies, of the relief and a loss of the person's physical presence and reminders of everything that he or she contributed to your life. He or she hasn't been there for the past few years. So there are all kinds of ways that we lose loved ones, from ambivalent feelings about them to this ambiguous situation to somebody who was dearly loved and very, very important, a deep attachment that can feel as if the world has just opened up and dropped you into an abyss.
Yeah, and I think Deb, you also touch into something that, this is kind of common sense. I think most of us know this, but it is different to lose someone suddenly than over the course of a long illness. Because when we watch someone suffer for years, we may feel relief that their suffering is at an end, and we may have done a lot of anticipatory mourning. It may be a kind of gentler process. Whereas if someone was in our life in a sort of significant way and then they're just gone, that can feel like a hole was just ripped in space-time continuum.
Yes, I think about when death comes at the end of suffering and illness, that death comes as the death mother, that she comes in this way that she is welcomed, that she is this benign presence, this longed for beloved, that can kind of lift us out of our suffering, that we might even welcome at the end of life. And as I've worked sometimes with people who are nursing someone towards that end, I'll often introduce this idea of death coming as a lover or as the Divine Mother to relieve suffering and to receive the person. And I suppose that I imagine that for myself, that if I'm well prepared at the end of my life, that I will welcome being released from the suffering of this body.
The image that comes up for me is that of the stranger, of something entirely unknown. The first time any of us really suffers a huge loss, it's the stranger, something that's unimaginably different, unknown, and strange, that our egos can't make sense of it. We've been abducted into some other realm altogether of feeling and meaninglessness and a terrible gaping hole, an absence, an awful absence where once there was a real presence. And I do think that occurs especially when death is unexpected and sudden due to an accident or something like that, let's say.
Deb, I I think you're sort of touching on a couple of really important things. And one of them is the way that, again, especially a sudden death can really put us in a place where we just can't, the ego just doesn't have any currency anymore. You know, if we can sort of accept the challenge of being in our grief, we're really plunged into an encounter with the self, I think, you know, in its dark aspect. I mean, if you really give yourself over to your grief, you're not able to kind of stay in an ego place, at least for periods of time when you're in that experience. And that can be a kind of initiation. You know, for some people, a grief is an initiation into the depths.
I think that in that kind of ego annihilation, and particularly being annihilated by helplessness,
mm-hmm.
and this relationship to the universe that is larger than anything we might have fantasized or imagined, that it does uproot the ego in a way that everything has to be questioned, and that all kinds of assumptions are challenged, and that we have this almost unbearable, dysregulated amount of feeling. And what can possibly intervene in the midst of that?
And I think right in the shock of that, what is needed most is care and understanding and allowing those who are bereaved to be submerged in a totally unfamiliar place and be cared for and be reminded, as so many religious traditions and rituals have built in, be reminded of life, be reminded of love. We are here. It's time to eat. We've brought food. Maybe, people are in the house, so that there is that sense of there is still life and surrounding you while you go into this real abaissement period of the initial bereavement.
Yeah, you know, there's this wonderful, I think it's an Irish story. It is an Irish fairy tale that is retold in the wonderful book, If Women Rose Rooted by Sharon Blackie. It's such a great story, and it's got all of these Irish names in it that I cannot pronounce. So I'm going to try to sort of retell it quickly, avoiding all names except for the heroines. So it's about this princess named Mies. I'm probably mispronouncing it. I'm so sorry. And her father dies in battle. And she is so overcome with grief that she literally turns into a kind of wild beast and flies up in the air, and she grows claws and feathers and fur, is spirited away into the wilderness, the woods, and lives there as a wild thing, kind of howling. So it's this image of how grief can be kind of dehumanizing. And it's only after some time that a king offers a reward to anyone who can capture her alive. And how she's sort of restored to her humanity is by a gentle harpist who goes into her woods and he takes off all his clothes and sits down and starts to play the harp, and he spreads out coins. And eventually she sort of comes to the edge of the clearing, and she listens to the harp, and she sort of says, "I remember that." And he says, "Oh yes," but he just keeps on playing, and his back is to her. And then she sees the coins, she's staring at the coins, and she said, my father had some of these. And he says, "Yep, why don't you sit down?" But she doesn't. And then he turns to her and reveals his genitals. And she's sort of staring at them, going, And so then she sits down and they make love. And over time, he plays for her. He makes food for her. He won't let her eat the food. She goes and captures a deer or something. She wants to eat it raw because that's what she's been doing. But he makes a fire and he cooks the food, and then he gently bathes her. And over time, he sort of scrubs away the fur and the feathers, and he trims her claws. And over time, he continues to make love to her. And over time, he kind of loves her back into being human.
That's really a lovely story about helping to bring someone back into life through loving and physicality.
The call to more life, too, right?
Yes.
It's because it's the return of eros, it's the return of libido, it's the return of connection to the world. Because sometimes grief, it disconnects us from the rest of humanity, and it disconnects us from, we sort of feel like we're not of the world anymore. I think that's part of the meaning of one of the most meaningful stories to me about grief, which is the Buddhist parable of the mustard seed. A woman loses her child, and she goes to the Buddha and she says, "You must restore my child to me." And he says, "I will if you can bring me back a handful of white mustard seed from the home where no one has suffered a loss." So she goes knocking on every door, and she can't find one house where someone hasn't lost someone. And part of the beautiful message of that story is that when we're in grief, we feel so alone. But it's sort of a reminder that this is just part of being human. It's a very painful part of being human.
So when I think about your parable of the mustard seed, it reminds me of the value of bereavement groups. That for some people, they'll all come together and share their stories of grief, which initially can be very intense. But there is something about normalizing this archetypal experience of grief that facilitates some kind of healing in us.
Of grounding it with other people and sharing the stories and the feelings takes it down from that sense of isolation and the archetypal bigness of it, and it humanizes it. That's one of the first tasks, I think. I like that story so much you told, Lisa, of that task of coming back into the sort of functional aspects of life, whether maybe being in a bereavement group, going back to work, having friends call you, people talking to you, of the connection in the real world, so that your daily life takes on perhaps a very new order and structure and form as you live without this person who is now gone. And then it takes more time, I think, for people to really process the emotional and intuitive, the inner world aspects of what the loss has meant. And of course, we don't just get over things. That will always be there, that this is a person who is absent. And that is a longer and more internal task. But knitting together those features of relationship and external world, libido, eros, and activities is very important.
A couple things come up for me around this idea of sort of being connected back to people. Or one thing, Joseph, that's a great point about bereavement groups. I hadn't thought about that connection with that story, but I really like that. Someone that I worked with who was grieving introduced me to this organization called Grief Share, it's a peer-run group, usually run at churches, I believe, and I think we can probably find it and link to it. And it was it's sort of a structured program, maybe 12 weeks or something, but it sounded like a really lovely program as she described it, and it was certainly helpful to her. And, it was just everyone in the room had lost someone. And one of the things they did at the end was they passed around 2 rocks. The first was very jagged and had sharp edges, and the second was very worn. And the idea was that over time, grief starts, in the beginning, grief feels like the jagged rock, and it never goes away, but over time it starts to feel like the rock whose jagged edges have become a little bit worn down and are a little bit less prone to cut us so easily. that seemed like a lovely way to share grief. And my second thought is, I lost someone earlier this year, and I was really touched by the cards that I received, the condolence, just cards or even emails that I got. I don't know that I understood their value before I was myself the recipient of them, although I've sent, my share of them in the past, but I don't know that I recognized how important they were. And it was just a sort of, and we're here too. And and I've lost someone too, and I know how that feels. And it just was sort of a reminder that even in my grief, I was connected with others.
I'm appreciating that, and the need for holding and the need for connection, even if the connection is being provided by the other people, because we're absorbed in the memories of the one we've lost. But I find myself ruminating a little bit about that fairy tale, the Celtic fairy tale of the girl who turns into this great beast after the father is killed. And I'm wanting to talk about it for a moment in the way that we analyze fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this young woman whose psyche is in some relationship to the father archetype, the father complex, the father principle. And when that is torn away unexpectedly, there's this loss of capacity, this enormous regression into a very primal state.
Totally unmediated archetypal state.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And then I'm thinking about that in a lived experience with a shocking loss, that when we are in a love relationship with somebody, that we depend on them over time to function in certain psychological ways for us. And that can be actually very common, like, my husband takes care of all the yard work, and I take care of this other thing in the house. But in a deeper way, we unconsciously assign certain psychological functions to the other person. I'll be the emotional one, they'll be the rational one. And so when there's a shocking death, that what we depended on them for psychologically is suddenly lost, it suddenly falls into the unconscious, and we're left with these kind of missing components in the psyche, which can leave us feeling intensely wild and very different from who we were before. And we could say that this man that appears to her, yes, it's a character in the story, but it's also this emergence from within herself of another kind of organizing principle that's able to meet her in her soul, that she's able to have and to drink in and to be penetrated by, which then restores her to what we would think of as a civilized ordering process. And I can think of any number of cases with people who had a shocking kind of loss. And one example would be, soldiers that are coming back from Afghanistan, and they're in these enormously bonded brother relationships. And in the training process and preparation, there's a tremendous amount of attachment that happens. And sometimes, horribly so, one of these brothers is killed, shockingly, in front of the men. And when we think about PTSD, we could think about this wild kind of beast that rises up out of the nervous system, that moves into this kind of thrashing state, and how is the ordering that the relationship held restored in some way in that archetypal sense?
Well, and I think that it's not just maybe the function that the person held or even the sort of ordering of that person. It's that our expectations about the universe get shattered.
Mm-hmm.
It calls up, I don't know, just questions about sort of the nature of our very existence, right? I mean, for one thing, when someone that we love dies, we're suddenly confronted with our own mortality as well. And, in that line, Jung talks about the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Tavistock lectures. And one of the things that he points out is that, Gilgamesh, this is the the ancient story of Gilgamesh, when his friend Enkidu is killed, Gilgamesh, rages around in grief. And I think he wears an animal skin and doesn't eat and everything. But he's also suddenly just overcome with sort of fear of his own death. He kind of becomes obsessed about death and what happens after death. And that's when the sort of second part of the story begins, where he goes on a quest to discover eternal life. So it's this way that being confronted with death at close quarters raises these very big, frightening questions. And it, that also comes up in King Lear. When Cordelia dies, his daughter, King Lear, says, "Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all?" It's like he's puzzling over her body. Like, how could this be? This doesn't make sense. Which I think it's that way that our assumptions about our relationship with life are shattered.
I'm thinking too about what Jung says, very much along those lines, that death is a fearful piece of brutality. There's no use pretending otherwise. It is brutal not only as a physical event, but far more so psychically. A human being is torn away from us, and what remains is the icy stillness of death. There no longer exists any hope of a relationship, for all the bridges have been smashed at one blow. I think that is the shock and our own vulnerability in it, our helplessness, and the sudden, fully felt realization that our own mortality is in the realm as well, that we do live on the edge of a precipice. When that realization comes in, it's not a space we can exist in forever. We have to have that reordering that the man in the Celtic fairy tale provides for the woman who has turned into a beast. We have to answer the call back to life and come to terms with the mystery and the dark initiation process that death can plunge us into, especially if it's a traumatic death. I mean, her father was killed, and Joseph, you're talking about people who lose comrades because they're in the army. Where is the life force going to come from when there's no life in us?
And in that kind of shattering of the ego's position, or kind of its losing of its footing, as you said, Deb, falling off the precipice, what we fall into is the unconscious. And in those moments, we discover that the unconscious is, a great thrashing sea. And yes, it holds the promise of our renewal, but it also plunges us into this undifferentiated confusion and this inability to kind of track our normal internal relationships. So people can be plunged into a kind of very complex grief process, and they find that they can't cook for themselves, so they can't wash, they can't think clearly, so they can't go to work for a long time. They can't take care of the things that they normally did. So there's this dismembering dissolution, and this being mixed together with something unprecedented and mysterious, and that when we recoagulate out of that, boiling vat of feeling, it's unclear who we're going to be when we emerge. I mean, in the best possible scenario, as you'd said, Deb, we have this relationship to death and loss that we didn't have before because it wasn't even real, perhaps, before that. Or looking at King Lear, having some kind of a lived relationship with this shocking, supernatural capacity of the universe to make changes. And then we walk into the world, and people walk into the world differently. Some, step heroically back into life. Some of them have a permanent psychological limp. And that's the mark, like Asclepius. The foot's been crushed, and they're going to move through the world with a club foot. But they move through the world.
talking about sort of coming back and moving through the world, I'm sure that the two of you have probably had experiences where someone begins to kind of thaw a little bit and come alive again and feels terrible guilt about that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like when you've lost a spouse and maybe you find yourself attracted to someone and you feel, ambivalent about that. You feel maybe excited about the new possibility, but just, is it okay? Is it okay for me to sort of rejoin the world of the living?
And for instance, is the widower betraying the deceased wife by taking on a new love object? But that's often a sign that the previous relationship has not been fully mourned, that there's still some kind of a difficulty in adapting fully to the reality of the loss. And then the losses which are not fully mourned really become ghosts that kind of haunt us. Again, pointing, an accusing finger because you're interested in dating again. Or another scenario is somebody inherits money from dad and then they can never spend it because they always feel like the ghost of dad is looking at them and evaluating, what they're allowed to spend the money for. I think those are signs that the grieving process has not been full enough.
I think also one of the things that can happen is when there has really been a very special love and a real bond, it can feel like giving up at least some semblance of the relationship itself, as if that person has stopped loving the person who is deceased. And that can be a very hard thing to part from, but I still want to feel those feelings of connection, of remembering, of keeping the love that we had alive in me.
And that goes to the myth of Orpheus, really. So the ancient myth of Orpheus, he's this incredibly talented musician who is, I think, the son of Calliope, the great muse of music. And as he moves through the world, he can charm beasts. He's extraordinary. And finds Eurydice, his perfect other, his beloved, who very soon after marrying is bitten on the ankle by a poisonous snake and dies. And in some accounts, it's actually on the wedding night. And unable to go through a mourning process, Orpheus is determined to retrieve Eurydice from the dead. And in this complicated way, finds the entrance to Hades with his incredible music talent, charms Hades, and the soul is released. And the admonition is, you can walk her back up into the lived life, but you must never turn around and look at her until you're in the sunlight. And as he's walking up this tunnel to the surface, of course, Eurydice is a spirit, so she doesn't make any sound. There's no evidence that she's behind him, and he just cannot tolerate not knowing if this is really happening. And he turns around and glimpses her, and at that point she's sucked back into Hades, and he has to continue his life desperately trying to find a way to cope with the loss. Marion Woodman once told, I think, in a tremendous variation on the myth, which is that as Eurydice is almost at the opening, and Orpheus turns around and looks at her, and in that moment their eyes meet, and Eurydice says, "Who?" And then she's drawn into the underworld. And I don't know where she got that from, but that is like a chilling moment. And that to me is a kind of initiatic moment that in all the efforts that we can take to resurrect or to constantly cling to our lost one, and then at a pivotal moment to realize that this presence that we are clinging to has moved on, and she's drank from the river of Lethe. She has no memories. She has no idea who he is. that she's being kind of drawn upward. She doesn't know why.
Oh, that is chilling.
It's such a poignant story, Joseph. That's really such a perfect illustration of how painful it is to have to accept the reality of the loss and the never againness of someone we have loved and interacted with and laughed with, of the finality.
All the bridges are smashed.
Yeah.
And one may have to go through all of this process of going to the underworld and charming Hades, or going through tremendous efforts to reconstitute the love object, to reconstitute the beloved, to finally have that moment where we're just there at the end of the journey, and to realize that the only choice is to let go.
Yeah.
And to walk into the light alone.
I think we're sort of edging into Elizabeth Kubler-Ross here a little bit too, with her 5 stages of mourning, which you guys might need to help me out here. It's anger, bargaining, denial, depression and acceptance.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's sort of like what we're talking about is how difficult it is to reach acceptance. And it struck me that active mourning is a way of remaining connected to our loved one. And so in a way, what's really difficult is to finish mourning. And there might be a way that there's this kind of prolonged mourning where we don't want to, like Orpheus, we just want to cling. We don't want to let go. Because finishing mourning will mean really, really kind of forgetting the person. I mean, not that you ever forget, but that they're no longer, that to not feel that active ache every single day is a severing of the final connection you have with the person. One of the images that I have for grief is, I think it was Jane Goodall, who, the primatologist, who was observing chimpanzees. And, baby chimps cling to their mother right from birth. So the mother doesn't actually have to carry them. The little baby clings and the mother can just, kind of move through the trees. But there was an infant chimp who had died. And the mother carried this infant. I want to say it was for like 5 days or a week. It was for a long time. This mother carried this dead chimp, and then finally she put it down. And to me, that is an image of mourning. It's like we're carrying the person with us.
Mm-hmm.
And then finishing mourning is saying, I know you're not going to come back, so I'm going to put you down. And that's in a way that's almost harder than losing the person, outright. Because then it's like we're giving up all hope then, isn't it?
Mm.
Which is the correct adaptation finally in that last moment.
That's right. To let her slip back into Hades, because what else can we do?
I'm thinking about, from the various stories, and I'm so aware of how in this podcast we have turned to mythology and fairy tale of those archetypal psychic truths that can provide a bigger frame, a larger arc for our personal experiences, that losing someone we've loved, however that takes place, is a really painful process. And it's even painful for a chimpanzee. It is hard, and it is the letting go, the leaving off of hope that maybe it can change. Maybe I can keep this person alive in my heart. Maybe to the realization of its finality. Hopefully something larger that is beneath ego's way of making sense in the world will deepen us and season us, and even initiate us into a bigger appreciation of what life is, what we have while we're here.
Well, it certainly connects us with the mystery and at least creates the possibility of connecting us with the transpersonal. I mean, I'm remembering that archaeologists have discovered, I guess, pollen or whatever in the burials of Neanderthals, that early humans buried their loved ones with flowers. That's very moving to me because it says that there was early on an awareness of death being a doorway to something transpersonal.
So that speaks to Jung's idea of the religious function, that there's something indigenous to the human soul that creates spiritual motifs, symbols, gestures as a way of capturing certain experiences that we can't hold with a kind of day-to-day consciousness. I do want to just jump back to a little bit to this idea of having difficulty with the transition. And one of the things that people will very frequently do is that they will refuse to grieve. They will refuse to mourn. And the early object relationship people called it a manic defense. That, there's the funeral and I'm at work. And I'm instantly at work and I'm not going to talk about it. And everybody at work asks me how I'm doing. And I'm just like, fine, that's fine. And suddenly I'm working 60 hours a week. And or any number of things that we kind of throw ourselves into to defend against the kind of emptiness that we're feeling. And even though we can tell ourselves that we're being resilient, or maybe other people might tell us that, there's a cost to pay, that the grieving life force in us does drop below the threshold of awareness, but it churns. And I've seen it come up at other times in the life as inexplicable periods of panic and anxiety, which is unnamed. It shows up as dreams of something chasing people and them waking up, kind of gasping. And really often it's this very painful feeling that they have refused but is not gone.
Right. They haven't let themselves kind of have that experience of that important, deep emotion. They've just been trying to ride on top of it. And that will generate this kind of empty feeling of anxiety. I want to just jump back 1 second to this idea that we were talking about just a minute ago about the death of a loved one possibly being a kind of entree into an experience of the mystery. And kind of maybe a question for you guys, which is, I know both in my personal life and in my practice, I've had a number of people who lost someone close to them who had a sort of, I want to say like a paranormal experience around it. Some of them are quite striking. And I think that's rather common.
That brings to my mind a book that has some of Jung's precognitive dreams where he anticipated the death of his mother, for example, and that it happened with other of his patients. And this is written by a woman who suffered a very intense grief, the loss of her child, and she is a Jungian analyst. Her name is Susan Olson, and it's called By Grief Transformed, and we'll provide the title in the show notes, of how many of those experiences, just as you're saying, Lisa, people do have, and that people have dreams, people have other kinds of premonitory sensations. And so there is a mystery here.
Or there's kind of a visitation afterwards, mm-hmm. where they just know the person's there, or they hear unmistakably a bell ring when there's mm-hmm. no one else, a sort of chimes ringing when there's no one else in the house that could possibly be ringing the bell or whatever.
Yeah, this is bigger than we can comprehend and just parse out from an ego point of view to say this is how it is. But we do know from the stories and evidence of so many people that these kinds of things happen, and it is mysterious.
Let's delve a little bit more into this idea of the self becoming active, and what does that look like? What does it look like perhaps before the loss and after the loss? How do we know that something enormous has happened in us, or how might we recognize it in somebody else? So one of the things that I'm thinking is when both of my parents had died, first my father and then my mother, that I did experience it as a kind of initiation. And one of the ideas that kept ringing through my mind, often for months after my mother's death, was, you are no one's child. You are no one's child, and you will never be again. And there was something about the power of that, the clarity of it. It was not terribly emotional. It was like the voice of reality speaking to me, but it set in motion these deeper capacities to abandon fantasies that I would be rescued at some point if I needed to be rescued, or that some larger force was somehow, going to give me advice. And so it put a kind of metal in my bones that was, I think, necessary and important, and a kind of resilience into my character that I did not know before, that seemed and still seems correct. It seems right. When I think of other stories, a friend of mine who had lost her husband, and she would very poignantly say that, my husband passed away of lung cancer, and we were very much in love. That those two sentences were always linked in this kind of Orpheus kind of way. And she went through a really lengthy grief process. And when she finally had the first glimmer of becoming romantically interested in anyone, what also emerged was this certitude that she needed to go back to college, become a pastoral counselor, and dedicate her life to being a grief counselor, and has worked for many years in hospice. So this kind of authority and position around loss and death wove itself into her bones, which gave her this capacity to sit with people in those similar situations, and the authority inside of herself to do that and be remarkably wise, calm, and contained in the storm of all of that.
Joseph, you're bringing up something in me. I think what you're saying is really important. And I'm also kind of going back to your point before about the sort of manic defense, is that I think as a culture, we're terribly avoidant of death and grief. And we kind of, as a culture, we sort of have a manic defense against it. I think you're really lifting up the way that allowing ourselves to experience grief does bring this kind of gravitas that allows us to meet life with, as you put it, kind of metal in our bones. But we don't often, as a culture, support going there.
Yeah, we don't make a lot of room in this manic culture to disassemble.
Mm-hmm.
At least, in the Jewish tradition, you sit Shiva. So at least you have 10 days where you're not going to leave the house. You're not going to look into a mirror to even consider your own self. You'll put on rough clothes, and you will sit and you will think about the loved one that has passed away.
Yeah. And you have these rituals that are containing.
Yes.
So I'm thinking about your question about, how do we know when there has been, some kind of connection with the self, and the story of the woman who became a grief counselor, what we do afterwards. Does this experience deepen us? Does it call us to life in some new way? It might not be as dramatic as that, but how can we be moved into kind of reweaving our lives and relearning the world, and that very deep place of acceptance of this is what is. This is who we are, and death will visit us. And what do we do in the meantime while we have life?
Yes, and to go into that internal inquiry to asking, what is emerging? Where is the libido gathering for this next stage? That, yes, we could just return to our old life and, pick up the threads of that and, weave something familiar back to us. And the self is not always activated in these kinds of losses, which is fine also. It's not like something's wrong with that. But in these shattering losses, that something new, I think, emerges that is visible, perhaps over time, and visible to other people. And that can be extraordinary. And that does show up in mythology and literature.
Mm-hmm.
And that there is something, for instance, in the archetype of the widow. In Victorian times, somebody was a widow for life, that you just abandoned all your clothing and you wore black. And it became a kind of identity with a cultural role that we had. So there's a way in which the culture can assign things, the self can assign things, that our families can assist us in returning to what's normal and natural to us. But I think what we're all saying is that there's something unpredictable about how we will return that's unique to each person.
Yeah, it's an individual journey. And I'm wondering with that, if it isn't time to switch to a dream.
Yes.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Our dreamer this week is 52. She is a woman and an artist and a poet. And here's the dream. There was a man, though he seemed not simply a man, but some combination of creature or childlike or otherworldly, maybe something that can turn into something else. And he was lying down and sort of whimpering. He was wearing a long, light-colored robe. Then I realized that on his side he had a large gaping wound and rotting flesh, and there were birds, many families of birds, feeding on his flesh. He was in great pain, but also kind of trance-like and internal. I had to help him. It was a grave situation. He couldn't help himself. He was helpless. He seemed pathetic. It would be a really long, painful death. I didn't know what I could help, but thought maybe if I took a hose and I could force the birds off with water. I did that, and maybe someone was helping me because as I hosed, it seemed there was another set of hands cleaning or holding the birds that came off. It was arduous. I thought it was a great infection, and how could I get him to a hospital? Then I woke up. And the context that she supplies for us is that she's been in a relationship for 7 years, and the future is uncertain, although she doesn't want the relationship to end. And she mentions that she's been studying the tarot and Jung, and began painting again and writing poetry in a more focused way for the past 1.5 years. She says the feelings she had in the dream were pity and awe and feelings of being inadequate to the task but resolute to try. She says she's had other dreams of hospitals and schools and institutions in the same time period, and that birds are a recurring theme in her dreams.
So I mean, the first archetypal amplification that just zooms into my mind is Prometheus. So in the story of Prometheus, who I believe is one of the Titans
Yes.
in the Greek mythology, that he's takes pity on humanity when all the other divine beings just really could care less, and humans are kind of groveling around in this primal state. And fire is reserved only for the gods. So Prometheus decides that he will steal fire from the gods and gift it to humanity, which in one way could be thought of as the beginning of civilization, the control of that element. And as punishment for that, of lifting humanity up, that he's chained to a rock, and every day an eagle comes to eat his liver. And he suffers that, and then at night it grows back, and during the day it occurs again. So if I were to just lean into that lens, it would put me in a kind of counterintuitive position to the dream, which is that there may be something archetypally valid about this man and these birds, which has to do with the cost of being a creative person. That Jung had mentioned that when we go deep into the unconscious and we retrieve certain things, that it's permitted by the unconscious, but it comes with a cost, which is why many artists suffer greatly as a result of their kind of audacity to make the unconscious visible. So I wonder if there is a sacrificial price that the ego is still struggling to accept in some dimension of her life, and to bear some kind of legitimate suffering in herself.
That's a really interesting interpretation, Joseph. And, of course, that was the same kind of image that came to my mind right away as well. And I think it's sort of interesting as a teaching dream, if you will, because it does kind of call forth this archetypal amplification of Prometheus. And it's also, we don't know if that fits or not. I mean, I think you've made a really good, you've tied it into the dreamer's life situation really beautifully, I think. And I imagine that might land, but we do have to be careful with archetypal images because sometimes they don't fit. And that could sort of be, kind of what the analyst brings to it. It can be really exciting to sort of see an archetypal image and maybe it fits and maybe it doesn't. I mean, I think another way of looking at it, and of course they might both be right, is, if this is kind of an inner figure, this man, he's, she makes such a point of saying that he's helpless. So there's some energy in her psyche that really needs tending to. And I think it's very positive that the ego, the dream ego, feels moved and committed to helping him. And I think it's interesting that it's birds. What would it mean to have birds feeding on your flesh? And what would it mean to take a hose and hose them off? It's sort of like a process of a cleansing process or something. But it strikes me again as significant that there's this commitment to do this, and then at the end there's a sense of, and I'm going to get him to a hospital. So some part of her psyche needs tending to, and she seems very, very committed to doing that.
I'm really appreciating the resonance that both of you have had to the myth of Prometheus. What I am resonating to is the anguish, the feeling tone in the dream of, first of all, he's a combination creature, childlike, otherworldly, maybe a shapeshifter, something that can turn into something else. So we have kind of an image that makes me go, oh my goodness, of something sort of really peculiar and odd and not right. He's lying down, so he's prone, whimpering. He's got a wound, rotting flesh, in pain. It's a grave situation. He was helpless. He was pathetic. It would be a long, painful death. Now, that is an awful lot of real suffering, images of suffering and pain. And I want to bring it down to where my question would be, where is that in her personal life, of bringing it down from the archetypal or mythic realm to, wow, she mentions that there's a relationship that's troubled in her life. And, I wonder if it's really that troubled as to evoke all these images of suffering and anguish.
And yes, Deb, yes. And it's such a kind of archetypal image, right?
Oh, I agree completely.
That I think it's a both and. Like, my guess is does touch on the relationship. That's kind of what she gives as her association or her life situation that seems relevant to the dream. And my guess is it would have much deeper resonances as well because of the nature of the imagery. The fact that it's this kind of otherworldly creature, that kind of puts us in a different realm.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's a both and I am also really interested in birds because it is an unusual sort of symbolism for birds that usually have a more sort of positive imagery in the psyche, and archetypally. The birds that fed on Prometheus was an eagle, so that is a bird of prey. It's a predator and a meat eater. But these birds, are not described as that.
And of course, if we had this dreamer here, that would be a question. Tell me more about these birds. What kind of birds are these? It makes a real difference whether or not it's a raven versus a sparrow, right?
Yeah, but birds often are associated with spirit because they can fly and they fly up. Maybe this is the dark side of the bird image or the dark side of a spiritual image. And then I'm interested in maybe someone was helping me. Here's a nice little clue to some sort of help from psyche. But hosing the birds off wouldn't be a typical way in which one would get rid of birds. So I'm curious about what is psyche trying to say here of washing the birds off. And it was arduous. And it was an infection. So part of me wonders, could the birds have been, what they were feeding on the rotting flesh, but could they have been functioning to clean the wound?
Like maggots are sometimes used to clean out rotted flesh.
Is there just another flip side to this, that to the dream ego, the birds look terrible, dangerous, predatory, and have to be gotten rid of? But maybe that's what needs to happen.
Which I think is very similar to what Joseph was saying. That there's a kind of telos in what the birds are doing.
Can she tolerate the process in her psyche? And if we take it down into the context, the future of the 7-year relationship's uncertain. I don't want it to end. So we could use a very kind of terrestrial interpretation, as we said before, that it represents either the beloved or the relationship itself, and she won't let it die a natural death. And she's determined to keep it kind of somehow resurrected. But I do keep wanting to go to this kind of more transcendental place because the creature's otherworldly. And it also brings up the whole category of the dying gods. Dionysus, Osiris, Prometheus, Christ. That there's something in that archetype that is very, very powerful. And if I were to translate that scene into the crucifixion scene and the Magdalene is at the feet of the cross, can she bear what's happening and still be in relationship to the loss, to what's occurring and stay conscious. When we think about the crucifixion scene in the biblical story, that I think all of the male apostles left. And it was actually Mary, his mother, and the Magdalene, his companion of sorts, who actually stayed there the entire time to witness the process.
That's such an important point of, can the dream ego bear it versus whisking it off into the hospital, which seems like sort of a sensible thing to do. But she says she's been dreaming about institutional kinds of things, hospitals, schools, institution-like settings, versus the natural world, versus the what is. I'm thinking about how organized hospitals and schools and other things are, and there's a protocol, and we're really in the realm of ego. But this dream doesn't take place in the realm of ego, and I wonder if she wants to put it there.
Well, I don't know. I feel a little bit more like, this is an arduous thing to get the birds off and to keep them off. And she does get some sort of mysterious help from some quarter. And it feels a little bit to me more, well, at least like it's a possibility that the right thing to do is not just to accept the death of this character, but to take him to a hospital and treat the great infection. And I think when we dream of hospitals and that kind of thing, it can often mean that we know there is a part of us that is wounded and needs tending to. I don't want to, deny the possibility of what you're speaking to, Joseph, that something needs to be sacrificed, but I'm just not sure I'm totally sold that that's the only way to look at this dream. It might really be right to treat the infection too. I think it's a little bit ambiguous.
And I think that's the nature of the unconscious and the nature of dreams, that dreams can be interpreted on many different levels and be medicinal from those different stances. And the question always is what can be made use of in the conversation with our analysans. And some things are useful immediately, some things become useful later upon reflection. But that the dream is working on the ego primarily, trying to nudge it towards something, and something that it's not seeing in the moment.
And we're doing that in a way, we're saying, well, if we looked at it from this angle, it might be this. But if we looked at it on the other hand, it could be that. In order to do that very thing of what will this dreamer be able to make use of, in the sense of like, oh yeah, that resonates, versus no, that doesn't resonate. And that is part of the process of relating to our dreams, and it may change. I know I've had several really big dreams that I saw a meaning in one way 20 years ago, and I see meaning in them altogether quite differently now, and it's all there.
Yeah, it's all there.
So that may be a good place, or at least a good enough place, for us to stop for this week.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show, and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.